So that's right. My name is Salim Firth. I'm glad to be here from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University today. At Mercatus, I co-direct the Urbanity project. And urbanity is our play on words. It has two meanings, of and pertaining to cities, and also the quality of being urbane. And so we believe that fundamentally cities, which is what some have called humanity's greatest invention, are about a lot of people, too many people to know each other, living together in a harmonious way that increases our productivity, our ability to create and enjoy culture, and expanding opportunity and prosperity for everyone. And so how we build those cities matters as well. It matters for whether they function well, and it matters for how big they can get, right? So can you have a large functioning city? You need good institutions, private and public. I'm going to talk about the market for neighborhoods today, and I think this is really fitting in a city like Raleigh, in a state like North Carolina. There are really three different types of places in the United States that our work covers. I think we focus most of our research and our attention on some really dysfunctional big coastal cities like San Francisco and Boston, which is where I'm from originally, which are very high priced. There's enormous demand to live there, but they just won't let anybody build anything. And so we're hammering away at just allow growth anywhere. And then there's the places like Akron, Ohio, which is a delightful town, or Rochester, New York, where I went to grad school and was able to buy a house for 28 grand as a grad student because it's really depressed. My father-in-law in Rochester is one of the last people keeping the lights on in the corpse of the Kodak organization. And those places have their own struggles. North Carolina is kind of this, like most of the big cities in Texas and across other areas, the Mountain West, the Sun Belt. It's a place that's growing rapidly, that is building housing for people who want to live here, and in a sense has more impact on the future of America than either of those other places, right? Maybe we can keep Rochester functional as it declines. Maybe we can allow more people to live in San Francisco where there are really high-paying jobs. But fundamentally, more of the new growth in America, more of what America is in the 21st century is going to be happening in rural Wake County than in suburban Boston. So the market for neighborhoods. I think that there's demand for neighborhoods. I think that there's a supply of neighborhoods, and I'm not sure if there's a market. And so that's what I'm going to be exploring today. I'm going to let you maybe come to some of your own conclusions about whether we should even think of this as a market, though I think I can convincingly say people want good neighborhoods. And we can say something about how they're created. They don't just happen. But whether there's really a market, maybe you can come to your own conclusions. So the discussion of being a good neighbor goes back at least 5,000 years. Moses says, love thy neighbor. Christ says, who is my neighbor? And answers that question. The scholarly research today is focused on a really individualist conception of what society and place means. So these are two concepts. Egohoods and spatial polygamy are two current concepts in the sociology literature. But I'm going to ask you to agree with me. Well, we all use the word neighborhood. You mean something slightly different than I mean when I say it. But I'm going to ask you to agree with me on three things today as we talk about neighborhoods for the sake of this conversation. That neighborhoods are social, that they're centered, and that they're not synonymous just with place generally. So social is contrary to these ideas. I want to talk about neighborhoods as a emergent social entity. So as a form of community, not just as a place that an individual experiences and samples. That clearly occurs. So these concepts, spatial polygamy is the sensible notion. This is a humorous graphic. Spatial polygamy is the sensible notion that we habitually do different things in different places. So when sociologists research how your environment affects you, they shouldn't just look at where you live because you might work or do leisure time in different areas, so they shouldn't just focus on one place. Okay, that makes sense. Egohoods is essentially the idea that arbitrary lines drawn on a map aren't very good at defining what is the neighborhood where you live, right? So just because there's a line going down the middle of 3rd Street that says that one side is this neighborhood and one side is that neighborhood doesn't mean that somebody living on different sides of the street really experiences a different place. And egohoods just says, hey, let's draw a half-mile circle around your house and that's your neighborhood, or your egohood. And both of these are deeply individualist concepts, right? These just say, this is the individual in place, and they experience the world as it's given to them. And I want to say a strong neighborhood, at least, is somewhere that has a set of social ties, of common loves and common concerns that draw people together even if they don't know each other. So a neighborhood is big enough that most people aren't going to know each other. In an urban environment, it's probably 20 to 30,000 people, maybe more. A typical neighborhood library serves 24 to 42,000 people in a set of cities that I looked at. In a suburban area, maybe neighborhoods are smaller than that, or certainly in a small town. But it's going to be a place where you kind of know the same businesses, you go to some of the same social or public things, and if you met somebody else who you didn't know but was in your neighborhood, you would have some things to talk about. Not every place is like that. So that's the other concept I want to say is not every place is a neighborhood. There are places that are just places. I'll show you some slides about that. There we go. This is a picture of Northwest DC where I used to live. To give you a sense of scale, it's 3 1/3 miles across this map. And how do we, in this big area where maybe 100,000 people live in this picture, how are those neighborhoods divided up? And this is where I want to insist on the other concept, which is centeredness. That a neighborhood is not defined by its border, but by its center. And we shouldn't really worry about the boundaries. So some of these boundaries are going to be obvious, like there's cemeteries and parks that kind of divide up areas in really clear, distinct ways. But internally here, I don't know if you can see, there's like 4 stars that I put on that are different commercial centers. Those function as neighborhood centers. They each have their own character and vibe. And if you live kind of in between them, whether we draw the line on this street or this street to divide those neighborhoods doesn't really matter. It's kind of which direction do you go when you go to the store, and where are the places that you have built your social ties. Similarly, this is a great exercise that the website Bostonography did. This is the city of Boston, and then up here is Cambridge. And so the black lines divide the kind of the city's official neighborhoods that they do for their statistics. The blue blotches are a crowdsourced exercise. They asked a lot of Bostonians, what are the boundaries of neighborhoods? And the dark blue shows areas of really strong consensus, and then it gets weaker. It's like, well, is this really Jamaica Plain? Does Jamaica Plain end here? Does it end there? And so this kind of blotchy blue areas. You see the city of Boston does a pretty good job. The neighborhood official lines line up with what people think of as their neighborhood. Cambridge, north of the river, does a really bad job. So this area in particular, that's Harvard Square. People think of Harvard Square as a neighborhood. They go to the square. Nobody lives in it. There's a lot of commerce. There's a university, obviously. There's a train station. So it's a place people go to from their home that brings people together. So the city thinks of these administrative residential units that are divided by main streets. But people think of the main streets as being the center or the core of their neighborhood. So I want you to agree with me on that, at least for today. This is a place where I said, not every place is a neighborhood. This is in Wendell. This is probably a neighborhood. This is Knightdale Boulevard. Probably not a neighborhood. I don't know. All right, so let's talk about first demand for neighborhoods and then supply. So the first question we have to ask, if we're going to ask if there's a market for neighborhoods, is neighborhood, is this kind of community, social community rooted in place, is that valued? I'm going to argue that it is, but it would be reasonable maybe to look at modern American society and say, by some people maybe, but it's just not that important anymore, and we have other forms of community. That would be a reasonable argument, and I'm not going to say you're horribly wrong if you believe that. We do know that there are 3 principles to real estate, and they're all location, right? So clearly people pay for good location, and I believe that they pay for good neighborhoods, not just good in the sense of high prices, good schools, and low crime, though those are clearly things people value, but also I think people pay more to live in places where there's strong associations, where neighbors know each other. When I bought a house recently in the DC area, one of the things that we really liked was that there were lots of Christmas lights up on our street, right? That it sort of showed a neighborliness, that when we were leaving the house after seeing it, an older gentleman from next door came by and said, "Are you looking at buying 127?" And encouraged us to move in. That's the kind of thing that I think people like, and people are willing to pay for something. When people pay for it, then we say there's demand. The tricky part is that we can't unbundle neighborhood amenities, right? Every location is that location. You can't say how much you're paying for the schools, how much you're paying for the crime rate, how much you're paying for the social connectivity. So people value being able to meet neighbors and walk dogs, but how much? And one of the things that I would actually encourage on the private side, so this is from Zillow, this is showing Durham, sales in the last 90 days. And one thing that I would hypothesize is that people leave neighborhoods that aren't as good, and at the same price point, they'll stay longer in a neighborhood that they really love. So maybe some of these areas on the west side of town with lower sales, but similar prices, are better neighborhoods. We say, okay, less turnover maybe means a better neighborhood. Certainly less turnover means there are more people who've been there for longer and know each other. High turnover sort of automatically breaks social ties. So that's something I would like to see some of these private sector places do. Because right now, one of the reasons that we might not have a market for neighborhoods, maybe people value good social connectivity, but they can't find it. Because not everywhere, you can't always shop for a house at Christmas time, and you don't always get greeted by a neighbor when you're looking at a house. And so you go to a place and you say, well, it looks nice, and it's in good repair, and I can look up the statistics for the schools and the crime and stuff online, but you can't look up online, how many of the neighbors know each other, whether people, leave their key at their neighbor's house for emergencies, things like that. So, maybe that's something we really don't know about. And if we can't find it, then we can't have a market, right? We might demand something, but if we can't physically or intellectually find it, then maybe that market doesn't exist. That's a major barrier. Why do people value neighborhoods? So I showed you the dog walking picture. That's one reason. Another reason is that there are amenities, right? And the amenities are valued. So being near a good public library might be an amenity that people are willing to pay for. I have small children. I value being near a public library. But maybe people value neighborhoods more that when they use these amenities, they have a sense of social connection or some familiarity with the proprietors and the other patrons. So that when you go into the place where you get your morning coffee, that they know what you want and they know your name, or that you run into somebody that you know, or that, again, when you meet a stranger, that you both really care about what's going in, and is the new such and such that's going on Main Street going to be nice or not? And that's something that you talk about because you care about that location. So I think that that's valued. But it might be that we only value really the consequences of strong neighborhoods, right? So even again, at the same price points, at the same income levels, you can have neighborhoods where people know each other really well, and that helps to reduce crime. This is known from, say, early 20th century crime fighting was heavily based on, the store owner saying, oh yeah, that was Jimmy, he knocked over, and telling the police who to go get. And because everybody knew everybody. And if you didn't have that kind of social trust and good relationship with the police, then you had higher crime because the police couldn't figure out who was doing it. So maybe we value the consequences of neighborhoods. So maybe good neighborhoods support the kinds of businesses that we like to attend. Good neighborhoods clean up the trash in the parks, and we like clean parks. We just like the consequences. And maybe there's some of us who only value the consequences, don't really value the social part, but we like being around. I talked to somebody in DC who's like, yeah, I love living in Bloomingdale. I love all the stuff here, but I don't want to know my neighbors. So, that's realistic. All right, let's move to supply. All right, so my hypothesis, I can't prove this to you. My hypothesis is that strong neighborhoods emerge where many residents interact with and value a common group of social or socially created public goods. I'll say that again. Strong neighborhoods emerge where many residents interact with and value a common group of social or socially created public goods. So public goods are things that everybody has access to. We might extend this to common goods as well. And everybody has access to these. So it's the kind of thing that you can just walk right in. Or there are public goods like low crime is a public good, high crime is a public bad. It's the negative of a good. The most obvious of these is schools. So schools are, and I am a proponent of school choice, but schools are like the last remaining thing that is kind of geographically fixed for most people, that you kind of automatically go to the one in your neighborhood. And in places with good schools, even where there is school choice, most people still go to the closest school. And it creates a connection. It creates this thing that a lot of people in the neighborhood really care about, the quality of. I have older childless friends who only buy homes in really good school districts because they know it protects their home value. I'm like, come on, people like me need those homes. You go live in the bad school district. So again, we when we make trade-offs like promoting school choice, I think that's good. It's good for education. It's probably more important than community. But we should be aware that there are consequences and that maybe we have to work harder in a world with more school choice. We might have to work harder to get the same level of community. We just have to be realistic about these trade-offs, even if we like them. Private enterprises can be public goods. So in the 19th century, cities built marketplaces, right, where many sellers and many buyers could meet. Sometimes they'd provide refrigeration, so they'd be running water, so there'd be a public health benefit to having food sold in this sort of publicly provided marketplace. There'd be competition, so there's this benefit of a market where many sellers can come together and buyers can choose among the many sellers. And essentially what happened when we got supermarkets started to privately provide a public good. Right? Public goods do not have to be government provided. A beautiful building is a public good. Everybody gets to look at your nice facade or your well-kept lawn, even though you privately provide it. Lowe's Foods, they provide the public good of access to all these foodstuffs. Now, the items in the store are private goods, so don't steal them. But your ability to walk in and have the opportunity to make a transaction is a public good. That's just offered to all freely. And we actually have the distinction, if like a Sam's Club, right, is not a public good. You can't just walk into Sam's Club and buy something. You have to be a member. So it's possible to have markets that are controlled access. Private proprietors, whether they're big or small, often create these social public goods. And they can be forums where people interact. They can be places people just grow to share attachments. And you care about whether these things are in your neighborhoods. Then the last thing is that neighborhood supply is usually driven by a very small number of people in the neighborhood. So right, the strength of the neighborhood, lots of people live there, but there's a few people, the proprietor of the barber shop, the investors who create the supermarket, the librarians who interact with all the little children in the library, and then some sort of super neighbors, like Joanna Taft, I'll tell you about her in a sec, who do most of the work of creating good neighborhoods. So Joanna Taft lives in Indianapolis. You can look in an upcoming issue of Philanthropy magazine for Jonathan Coppage's profile of her, or you can just Google several profiles have already been written. Her and her husband Bill have founded a church, an art museum, 2 schools, a few neighborhood associations. She's the kind of person who is doing the amount of work that would probably have a significant 6-figure salary if she was putting it into a private business, but she's doing it for these nonprofits and for her neighborhood in a way that has created from a half-vacant old neighborhood on the north side of Indianapolis, has created this really vibrant mixed-income community with really interesting social institutions that draw people together where people know each other. It's a very strong neighborhood because she's kind of doing this work out of her own passions. So most of us are free riders. And that's not bad, right? Like, that's the nature of public goods, is that if most people weren't free riders, they wouldn't be public goods. That we get to enjoy a strong community. We get to go to the grocery store. In my neighborhood where I live, we've got a grocery store just 3 blocks away, so we can run out there and buy milk when we need milk or something that goes in the recipe. But we don't do most of our shopping where we drive past it and go to a cheaper grocery store 2 miles away. So we're free riders on this grocery store being there. The other patrons who do all their shopping there, they keep the place in business. But we benefit because when we want 1 or 2 items, we can get it at a reasonable price because this thing exists. And it's similar with community organizations, with churches, et cetera. If you show up, you can form yourself to the patterns that are established by the people who really built up these institutions. All right. This is 1968. So the summer of Chicago in 1968, not known for being a really peaceful place, but if you went outside of certain parts of downtown, it was actually really, really delightful. July 4th. Every person who writes about neighborhood in the US over the course of the last 2 generations says that there's been a precipitous decline in community. I'm not old enough to be able to attest to that personally, but if you read Alan Ehrenhalt's The Lost City, about Chicago in the 50s. If you read Charles Murray's book or Sebastian Junger's book, you get the same narrative over and over again. So either the baby boomers are all super nostalgic and are lying to us young people about what life used to be like, or I think we can trust such a unanimous agreement that neighborhood has declined precipitously in living memory. And I think we want to know why. And for a place like North Carolina, which is building rapidly, we want to know, are there things that we can do to create the kinds of communities where neighborhood, in the social communal sense, can really emerge? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So I would say that decline happened because our egohoods, remember that concept, like the area around where we live that we can kind of freely move around and is close to us, expanded so large that it no longer is a small enough area that the people within that area could have a reasonably thick social fabric, right? So the easiest place to have a strong neighborhood emerge might be an island. This is from The Truman Show. So right, if you're on an island or on a giant creepy TV set, you're going to know everybody in there, and you're going to be forced to have a bunch of relationships that are overlapping and have a really strong, thick social fabric. There's all kinds of problems with that, right? Like you feel stuck, maybe. Or you might get this if you're in a really isolated rural town. I think rural small towns are the place where there's probably been the least decline. Everybody still knows everybody. Everybody shops at the same places. But if you're in most US metro areas, and these are, if anybody lives at these houses, I apologize. I picked these completely randomly. A 20-minute drive in Raleigh or almost anywhere else can bring you to the front doors of any of hundreds of thousands of neighbors. And that's not long, right? That's an easy trip to make. And so you see the problem. Like, you have all this choice, and you sort of choose your friendships, but those friendships don't overlay with other people's who live near you to create a thick social fabric. You know approximately as many people as you might have known 60 years ago, but they aren't concentrated, and therefore they don't know each other. So that's fine if your friendships are rewarding and great. I'm not saying you should have different friendships, but realistically, if we care, maybe we don't, but if we care about the emergence of a thick social fabric, we have this challenge that we live in a world where we have so many choices, and that the ways that we make those choices we individually optimize leads to a decline in the social fabric. The smartphone comes in for a lot of abuse these days as the kind of the origin of the decline of American society. But I submit that with respect to neighborhoods, the automobile is the main culprit. So like the smartphone, the automobile gives us all kinds of options, makes us more productive, not like a smartphone, gets us to places that we want to go. I chose to drive here rather than fly from DC so that I could get around once I was here, right? Like the automobile is great, but that's the fundamental tool that is creating those large egohoods, the ability to have the whole metro area at your disposal. The result, so here's a map in the DC area of the people who go to my church. And there's actually like 5 or 6 families that live outside the map, but I didn't want to zoom out so much that it was just a cluster. If you like drew a circle around this, you'd probably have like 2 million, 3 million people living in it. Even if you just took the core area where most of us live, you're still going to be looking at least 300,000 people. So we're maybe 150 people, 60 families-ish, scattered among 300,000 people. We aren't going to run into each other much. So we have a great community. I love my church, and it's got community in the name. But the investment that we make in the church community does not contribute meaningfully to any kind of broader community, right? We're not part of a town or a neighborhood in the city where our relationships interweave with the relationships created at the local school or the local stores. And that's an area that was built up largely before the automobile was everyone's means of transportation. If we look at areas that are built up in the automobile era, those are much weaker. So it's difficult to have. So in DC, you can walk to your local place, and there's enough things that are close by that you can have a centered life if you want one. In Raleigh, largely not. So you guys probably all know where this is. This is a strode. So I don't know if you've ever heard of a strode. It's a coinage of Chuck Marone's. But a strode is a road that is trying to be a street. You might also, if you aren't from the transportation background, think that a street and a road are just synonyms, and those are two words that we have to describe the same thing. But people in transportation like to distinguish streets from roads. So a street is a place. It gives access to all the addresses, the businesses and residences that are along it. A road is a way to get from point A to point B. Roads work really well when they're long and straight and you can go really fast. And they also are much safer, right? So an interstate is far, far safer than a road like this. Roads also work well in terms of moving traffic better when there's not a lot of turns and not a lot of intersections. Again, you know this, you drive. Streets work well when there's lots of addresses close together, when you can access things, when you're moving slowly enough that you can see the place that you're looking for, whether that's because you're driving slowly or you're on foot. And what stroads are is basically you have a road, there's lots of traffic going down it, getting from point A to point B, and some enterprising businessman says, you know, if my business were the only one on the road, I would get tons of business because everybody would stop because everybody has to come by anyway. And then some enterprising local politician says, you know, if we zoned our entire road for retail, we would get more tax revenue. And that's an important source of local tax revenue in North Carolina, as in many other states, is you get both the property tax and the sales tax from a retail business, and they don't have school children, though that's decided separately here, as we discussed before. So both the business people and the politicians have an incentive to essentially overbuild retail along the roads. And this kind of, from the business perspective, there's a prisoner's dilemma. Why would you stay in like the local street if everybody who gets to your business has to drive past your competitor to get there? And even if this ends up being worse for everyone, you don't want to be the person who says, well, I'm going to be principled and I'm going to stay in town. Though I applaud Universal Chevy in Wendell. We drove past that today. This is not a free market outcome. All right, so in one sense you could say, well, it's free market. There's, the businesses would all like to be there because they're on the roads, and it's not up to government to solve prisoners' dilemmas problems. But government is actively abating the death of the old downtown, right? So there's two things they're doing. First, they're overzoning for retail. Retail land is cheaper than residential land because every community wants to have this the rateable. You can tax and get lots of good revenue off of retail. So every community would like to be the retail center and like to make the other towns be the ones that have the residences. So they overzone for retail, and then they put it along the state's roads because the state has to pay the costs of widening and widening and widening that road as they bring more and more retail traffic. So the state ought to be building more limited access highways and say, hey, you can't build commercial along this. This is the way that people are supposed to get in and out of the city. We spent state taxpayer money on this so people could move from point A to point B, not so that it could be the driveway to your business. The state doesn't go around building exits off the interstate for a gas station, and that functionally at a slightly lower level is what's happening here. The other thing that localities do, that again, not free market, is to give tax incentives to the big box businesses that will come in these huge lots along the major roads. And so I understand it's the era of Amazon and Walmart. Amazon and Walmart do great things and have really, really good supply chain logistics, which is how they undercut local businesses. But when they also get a tax break that the locally based business doesn't get, that's not the market. So I have nothing against Amazon and Walmart. But if your locality is giving them a tax break, and then you wonder why the hardware store downtown doesn't survive, that's not fair. And so here I said it's not a private sector. Okay, well, we know what the private sector does when the private sector builds roads. This is the Woodlands outside of Houston, which is basically a privately-ish built city on the outskirts of Houston. They don't build stroads in Woodlands. They have parkways. So this parkway has an exit right off the interstate. So you come up the interstate from Houston, then you get off into this parkway. You see nobody's going to be walking around here. There's nothing to get to. So you're not going to have the fatality rate that you have on a strode. Stroads are, along with rural roads, the place where we have traffic deaths. If you want to go to commercial, at one of these intersections, you turn off into the commercial section. And it's still auto-oriented, right? Those big parking lots, it's made to drive to. But the private market says, this would be a really bad way to use our parkways. People don't want to have to sit through traffic and left turns when they're getting to their house. And these parkways kind of go in and like distribute you through the neighborhood where your house is. So I think I have some justification for saying the market doesn't build Stroads when it internalizes these consequences. Oh, who put words on this slide? So policy. Policy is private and public. We should not think of policy as being something only government does. People individually, and especially in institutions, have habitual ways we make decisions. We don't just re-optimize every single day and decide what we're going to do. I get up and I have French press coffee every morning because that's my policy, right? Like, that's kind of a trivial example, but if you're a business, you have ways of doing business. And that's the same way that a government sort of gets a track. So we should think about, in our private institutions, whether the policies, if we care about neighborhoods, I also want to say, this policy is all, if you care about neighborhoods as a social entity. You may not. Or you may say, that's nice, but to do this thing, I would have to give up on something else I care about more. And I'm not at all here to say that neighborhoods are the most important thing. Housing affordability, for instance, is much more important. I would never say in San Francisco, where I'm arguing with people to build more housing, that like, oh, you need to be really careful about where you build, but just build the houses. That's more important than whether you get great community out of them. But if we do care, here are some of the marginal things we can do. So on the private side, the first is, because neighborhoods are largely dependent on a handful of really active volunteers and good neighbors, you can be one of those. And the really great thing about this is, even if you're in a fairly weak neighborhood, the handful of people who does all that volunteering and invests in those institutions, they get to experience a good neighborhood. It's smaller, it's the other neighbors, the other people who really care about that stuff. But you can get that if you jump in. You don't have to be Joanna Taft level to make a difference in your neighborhood. Secondly, if you are a business, locate your enterprise somewhere walkable. Walkability is actually good for drivers too, in the sense that they drive there and then they frequent more than one business. And it's not like, oh, driving is horrible. It's when you drive, do you end up in a place that's actually pleasant to be? Walkable doesn't just mean is there a sidewalk. It means, would somebody want to walk there? Would you walk your dog there if you had the choice? And making that kind of choice with your enterprise strengthens the neighborhood that's around it, because you're going to have these interactions that are at the micro level and have more of the kinds of social ties that are formed in a tighter geographical space. And then the people who can be most creative here are developers, right? So I showed you the Woodlands, and you're seeing this in lots of other spheres where developers are doing things differently. I drove around this morning in a clearly new urbanist-inspired suburb that's being built up, Wendell Falls, I think it was called, near 64. And so they're drawing on this architectural school of thought called New Urbanism, which is totally misnamed because what New Urbanism does is promote old suburbs. It's like the Holy Roman Empire of development terms. But you can, as a developer, push to include the kinds of destinations that people want in your development. So my colleague Emily Hamilton has showed that people nationally pay about 20% more for houses, controlling for the physical characteristics of the house, if they're in a high walk score area. Or if you maybe go from like above average to below average, maybe you can't go from the extremes, but like above average to below average, maybe 10% more. So people do value the ability to walk to places. And so if you're a developer, you should be pushing, say like, hey, county, I'm going to put 500 school children in this tract. Can you work with me to have a school that they can walk to? Can we get a public library here? And pushing for that and pushing for retail zoning as part of your development in a way that's going to work for the retail, not overzoning. Then on the public side, similar location decisions, which I already talked about. Quit building Stroads, right? Enough with the state DOTs accommodating driveways for every business. That's not the market. Stop overzoning for retail. Stop giving tax breaks to the big box people who are going to come in and eat your downtown alive. And then wonder, and then like, oh, now we need to put signs downtown and like pleasant shrubbery because people stopped going to our downtown stores. Well, you give the tax break out on the Stroad. And then rewrite your subdivision regulations. Zoning should just be gotten rid of altogether. Subdivision regulations, we probably need some rules on how you connect new public roads to old public roads and new utilities to old utilities. But the way that we do that should focus on integrating new growth with what already exists, instead of the model that seems endemic here in North Carolina, which is you have one road which was built when this place was tobacco farms, and no one has ever built another road. And everything else is just going to be little feeders onto that road, and that road is going to become horribly congested. When you grow, Raleigh is going to be the size of Charlotte in a few years, and Charlotte's going to be the size of Atlanta. You need to prepare for this. This is going to be your place, and whether it is an unpleasant, congested mess, or a place that you can still get around and feel like your place is a place, that your town is a town, that's a matter of these choices of how you build your infrastructure and how things tie together. So I would say, somebody asked me, oh, are you going to go promote smart growth? And no, smart growth is mostly about a set of new regulations to put on top of the old regulations. They always say they're going to get rid of the old ones, but they never do. So I'm not about smart growth. I would say I'm about integrating growth. Growth that integrates with the strengths of what you already have. So look at what is already good about your community and say, we want to make sure that the new stuff we build connects to that. That when subdivisions are built, they don't end in cul-de-sacs, that there's a road going out, because it's going to be somebody else is going to want to live here. This is going to be a good place to live. And so every subdivision should connect to the one next to it. It should connect back to your commercial center. And then you'll have the kinds of places where, not automatically, but potentially, a strong neighborhood can emerge. So I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention. Parking minimums are dumb. The market knows how much parking it needs. There are maybe some cases where you have street parking that the business is going to use up all the street parking, but then you can basically say we're going to have residential stickers or something, and that's a much better system than requiring every business to build a lot of parking. What you get with that, different businesses function at different times of day. So the place that's mostly a dinner restaurant can share parking spaces with the office building where all the workers leave at 5:30. And what you get when you have individual building parking minimums is you get the church has all these parking spaces that they use once a week. And if they didn't have the parking minimum, the market would figure out that, like, hey, the church doesn't want to raise all that money from its parishioners to build a giant parking lot for once a week. They're going to locate their facility next to some office park where the parking sits empty on Sunday. And so it's not anti-parking, it's pro-market. Houston has done this, Cincinnati's done this, Hartford has done this, Buffalo has done this. San Francisco just did it. The end of parking minimums, at least in big cities, is coming. And it would be nice to see it to come to the suburbs as well, but that hasn't happened yet.
Questions and comments?
I was wondering about the concept of market for neighborhoods. It seems like at different price points for houses, you expect certain things in a neighborhood. And if you have those things, the neighborhood is sufficient, and so you'd probably move there. If it doesn't, you wouldn't. So if I'm buying a $250,000 house in Raleigh, I expect there to be some shopping nearby and good schools and that kind of stuff. If I'm buying a $40,000 house, I'm thinking, well, I'll be lucky if it's not located in the jail. So, I mean, it seems like there's a sufficiency, but there's not okay, well, in this great neighborhood, then that adds a tremendous amount of value to the house. I'm an example of this in that, we moved into a neighborhood because it was close to a job that my wife had but never took.
Right.
And it was near a mall that then died, and then a developer came in and turned it into a great new shopping center.
Right.
So also there's a dynamism of the neighborhood doesn't stay the same.
Right.
And so like for us, the neighborhood wasn't really a concern as long as it had decent schools and there was some shopping around it. And then those things have changed significantly over the 30 years we've been in the neighborhood, some for the better, some for the worse. But we bought it for the house.
Right.
And given the house, then it came with a certain amount of amenities.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I'm certainly not saying that, like, the social neighborhood is the most important or one of the top 3 things in home prices. There's much more influential things. The most influential is simply regional home prices, right? So like you can get a falling down shack in Boston and it's going to cost more than the nice $250,000 house you got here. So that's hugely important. And then these other major factors like commute distance in school and crime are really big drivers in the physical shape of the house. So it's kind of the question is, even if like the social neighborhood is only 5%, 5% of a home price is still a lot of money. So we can still talk about demand there, even if it's a pretty marginal demand, just like we talk about demand for finishes in a home, right? Clearly there's a market for finishes in a new house, and like people pay more for I don't know why people pay more for stainless steel, but they apparently do. This is completely beyond me. My wife will pay actively less for stainless steel. Those things matter at the margin, but they're not driving the major trends in home prices. So I'm certainly not claiming that. But I might be wrong, right? It might be that, I would say that's the weakest part of this story that I'm telling is maybe there actually isn't that much demand for neighborhood. Maybe this is something that, it's kind of nice, or like we like to think that we like, but realistically, it's like going to the gym, right? Like you maybe pay for that membership once, but you don't actually go, and like it's not really something we care about.
Sufficiency that, if
Right.
it's a bad neighborhood, you won't live in.
Yeah.
Unless you have to. But, would a good neighbor, and then also, and then each person has different feelings about what a good neighborhood is. Some
Right.
people want to know all the neighbors, some people
Right.
want those people involved.
So I think of neighborhoods as strong versus weak rather than good versus bad, because I think the good and bad usually goes with crime and prices and the incomes of the people around you, and I want to sort of avoid making that claim. Howard Husock has this great quote, which I've encouraged him to use as an article title, which is a poor neighborhood can be a good neighborhood, right? And that you don't have to be affluent and have all the amenities to still have that kind of neighborhood strength. So I use strong and weak, but I might be wrong, right? Those might not exist in a meaningful sense.
Melissa? I'm fairly involved with our neighborhood action committee in this area.
Awesome.
And how do we, as citizens, combat big money developers coming in from out of town, sweeping in, building these great big monstrosities, and then taking off again? And the zoning people seem to be all recent college graduates, very idealistic. And, I mean, we come up against this in City Hall. What do we do as citizens?
So the thing to do is to work with the developers. This is where I say integrating growth, right? To say,
Do is vote against them.
well, yeah, so I don't want, I'm on the other side from you. I'm one of the young idealistic. I'm not that recent of a college graduate, but you can make yourself San Francisco if you try hard enough, maybe. I actually don't think you can. You could make yourself maybe Atlanta, like really bad commutes, because like every community blocks growth, so then it goes to some exurb until there's enough people there who block growth, and it goes to the next exurb, and then everybody's driving 30 miles past you, and you're like, why is my highway congested? Well, it's because you didn't allow people to have short commutes, and they're spending 30 miles on the road instead of 5 miles. So I don't want you to block growth. But I do want you to participate in the process and say, let's make this so that it connects to our strengths. So if somebody comes in and says, we want to put 40 million square feet of retail, say, that's kind of too much. You're going to destroy our existing stuff. Can we have a mixed-use development? Can we? And most developers want to do what the market wants. And to the extent that what people who are going to move into your community want is also what you value about your community, then your input is valuable. But I would say that the unfettered development is a lot better than no development for the economy. So otherwise you just end up being a regulator, right? Like the private rights of people to dispose of their own property are kind of this bedrock idea that we've really gotten away from in land use. And I didn't talk about that a lot today, but that's what I talk about 99% of the time.
What we're seeing in these big high-rise apartments is that they come in and they say they're going to do mixed use, but we have all these empty storefronts on
Right.
the ground level, and nothing ever goes in there.
Right.
And
Yeah, no, that's the overzoning for retail, right? So retail space is artificially cheap. The city pushes for mixed use because it wants it, because it's people who are all educated like me. But then brand new retail space is really expensive. They tend to build them too large because they want to have national chain tenants who always make rent, right? So if you get an Applebee's and it doesn't get enough customers, national Applebee's kind of steps in and like covers rent. But if you get a mom and pop restaurant and they can't make rent, well, you just don't get paid. So people don't want, you know, what was it, Whitney's Chocolates that we saw in like this falling down building in Wendell, you know, which is, I don't, is she paying anything in rent for this like old shack? I don't know. But that's not going to survive trying to pay the rents in a brand new building. But we even in DC, where there's this, you know, massively high prices, we have this problem.
Okay, time for one more quick one.
Well, you start on there because back under your policy, I'm all on board and got the stop giving tax breaks to big box stores. But I've been struggling ever since you introduced it with that concept of over-zoning for retail, because I try not to let my own experience be indicative of what's actually going on. But I generally view retail as being contrasted kind of market versus city planners deciding what the appropriate amount of retail is. I've shied away from that second part. So to what extent are you, you were starting to touch on it, could you dig a little deeper in what this concept of overzoning is? Because in most of my own experience as a former planning commissioner and being involved in that sort of thing is that retail zoning is usually in response to a market demand. What more do you mean about overzoning for retail? I think we're getting there.
So the fact that retail and residential have to basically stay in their own corners, right? So maybe I shouldn't call this overzoning for retail. I should call it underzoning for residential. But it's sort of reserving these prime corridors for retail, even when retail is not the market use that would pay the most, and even when this sort of like in the long run hurts the functioning of the road and hurts the sort of the long run. I didn't talk about the sort of the local fiscal impact, but you should check out the work by Urban 3 in Asheville. You certainly know them, but they're you know, bleeding edge local fiscal policy consultancy out in Asheville that is, you know, kind of anti-zoning, pro-market. So fundamentally, yeah, and maybe North Carolina functions a little differently, though with the sales tax, local sales tax revenue, I suspect that is not the case. But in most of the country, local planners would like to have lots of retail, and anytime they can find a retail business to come in, so there's market demand, but it's like, it's not really the market if you say, well, when a retail person says they'll pay $100,000 for a plot, then that's the market, but when a residential or industrial says they'll pay $300,000, that's not the market. Like, well, that's not the market anymore, right? Then you're just picking the participant that you want because they're going to pay the most taxes. So thank you. I'll be around for a little bit for those who have further questions. Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
And I think there's packets from Mercatus with my research and some others on the way out.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you on Thursday. If you want to come to the lunch on Thursday, please register online today. We'll see you here next week.